Thank you so much for the invitation and also for the introduction, Sarah. And I think that really sets the stage for what I'd like to say as part of this conversation. So before I begin giving my main remarks, I just want to give you some context for how I got into this conversation. So as was mentioned, I'm an engineer. And so this is not really my area of scholarship, but it overlaps significantly with my experience as a Black female going through engineering. And so in the wake of George Floyd and a lot of the conversations talking about racism, I realized I hadn't actually experienced in my memory a lot of overt racism, but I did feel that my experience reflected a lot of what I call unequal burdens that I had going through my career. And so some of them look very innocuous, like being asked to help my university have diverse committees. So take last week, for example, I was asked to be the diversity speaker for a student organization, which is great, and I would love to contribute to that. At the same time, I need to now reflect on whether I'm going to do that or give up time with my child in the car because that's my carpool day, and I spend quality time with my kid. And my white colleague isn't asked to make those same choices. And there are other things like going to extra activities, attending conferences where I might see more people who look like me so that I can get more mentorship because there are, quite frankly, a dearth of such people on my college campus. When I go into the classroom, I do get scrutinized in ways that some of my colleagues do not, and it gets reflected in teaching evaluations. And some of the comments are quite disrespectful. Every time I walk into a room, I remember when I first started as a junior faculty member, I would go into a meeting, and if it was like an event for the Chancellor or something, I was wondering, okay, if they take my picture, is it going to show up on the front page of the university's website because they want to showcase their diversity initiatives? And just other things that my colleagues have felt in terms of like how their name might be viewed on applications. Or even sometimes, like if I want to work at night, I really worry about if I should work at night. I'm wearing a sort of dress suit now, but honestly, I'm most comfortable in sweats and a hoodie, but that's not always the thing that I feel like I can wear walking around campus when I want to get my work done. And so these felt a little bit burdensome, and so I thought that, particularly because none of these experiences are acknowledged in the promotion process or compensated in any way, I did feel like I had something to bring to the table in terms of this conversation. I also heard around this time a quote that I thought really embodied some of my life experience, which was the idea of systemic racism, which isn't something that I had known really how to define it, but someone defined it as living in a system that's not defined with you in mind. And I think a lot of us might have experiences of that based on our different identities, but this really embodied a lot of my experience as well. So in the wake of George Floyd, several of us in engineering decided, well, we probably need to say something. And so a group of us in engineering got together and formed a collective. And as part of that collective, we decided we didn't want to just talk amongst ourselves. We wanted to do something. And so I, in particular, wanted us to put a paper out there and really charge institutions to think about how to become more anti-racist institutions. And so I'm not going to talk through what's all in that paper. And if you'd like to, I encourage you to read the action item list that's at this link here. But the paper actually has targeted recommendations for various constituencies. But most important, when I was helping to draft this paper, my co-author and I said, you know, if we write this paper, but people don't come to it with the right perspective, they're not going to do anything with this paper. And this is really related to what Sarah was just saying about lots of plans are made, but not everything is followed through. And so we felt that it was important to establish 5 principles before you really engage and do this work that should frame what you do and how you think about it. I call them pre-decisions or pre-commitments. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about with the rest of my time today. So the first principle is attitude, okay? So here's my boarding pass that got me here. It says Boston on it, and I'm gonna make a confession. I almost got on the wrong plane, okay? So I was sitting in the airport knowing that I'm going to Boston, and then all of a sudden, you know, there's all this stuff going on in the PA system, and then I hear a call for a plane to Boston, except it's the gate right across from where I'm actually sitting. And I'm like, oh my goodness, they're boarding my plane. So I get up and I move over, and I don't want to be embarrassed because people are like, you know, why is she leaving? So I go sit over there, and I'm like, okay, great. I plug in my computer. I'm sitting there waiting. And then I realize that it's a different airline, also going to Boston at a different time. And then I realized I need to go back to where I was sitting before so that I could get on the right plane. Now, the reason I bring that up is because, again, the PA system was talking about all sorts of announcements in the airport. But the only reason I was tuned in to Boston was because I knew that I was going to Boston, and I identified myself as someone who was going to Boston. And so because of that, I could pay attention and listen to announcements related to going to Boston. And in many ways, that's the attitude that we need to come to the table with for this work, okay? So unless we agree and assume from the beginning that we have something to learn, that we are potentially racist, we're not going to be attuned to the recommendations. If you read a paper but you come to it thinking, oh, I'm not racist, this doesn't apply to me, it's going to be really easy for you to look at this and see that there's nothing for you to get done. And so really famous quote that I like is, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Basically, your attitude frames what you're going to get out of anything else. And so if you take nothing else away from today's conversation, I encourage you to open yourself up to the idea that you might be racist so that you can listen to what everybody else has to say and the recommendations and identify something that might actually be meaningful and lead to change. A lot of times also people tend to blame the system. Oh, it's not me, it's the system. Well, we are the system. So whatever happened in the past, that's past, but if we want to change the future, if we want to change the present, it's really on us, and we're part of the system, so you need to kind of own that as well. And then if you don't, well, this is part of what makes the system what it is, right? It just makes you complicit in that. The second thing is clarity. So when we were talking about this work amongst my group of colleagues in engineering, we recognized that we were working on anti-Black racism. We weren't working on racism more generally. We were really focused on it. I work with light. That's what I do in my daily scholarship. And all of you probably know the sun has a lot of great light. And when you have a magnifying glass and you focus that light, it can set a forest on fire, right? Focus is really powerful. Any of you who wear glasses know that focus can help you do things that you can't do if you cannot see properly, right? And so when you're doing this work, I really encourage you to think about bringing in some focus. Okay? This is not to say that there aren't other forms of diversity that matter, but I encourage you to choose something and be focused in your efforts to solve that problem. We can't solve everybody's problem all at once, right? And if we try to solve everybody's problem, we're gonna end up solving nobody's problems. And so I'm not telling you which group to pick first, okay? For us and for what we were doing, we were focusing on issues associated with being Black in America. But I really think that getting clarity on what you're trying to do is really important to make sure that you're gonna actually achieve outcomes at the end. The next thing I want to talk about is about accountability. So Sarah brought this up as well. So if I said to one of you, please can you go and spend $10,000 to buy me a new couch for my office or whatever. Not that any of you would really want to do that, or I couldn't really spend that money, but whatever. Let's say you were going to spend $10,000 on a couch. Likelihood of you just going out and doing that because I asked you to do it is probably pretty low. But if I said, hey, can you take my credit card and go spend $10,000 and buy this couch for me? The likelihood of you being able to actually do that goes up infinitely, right? And so the idea that we need to empower people to be able to do things before we ask them to do things is really important. And I just realized I skipped over my slides, so I don't have my normal. Okay, I'm gonna go forward. And go back. So this is the idea of commitment and resources. A lot of times we tend to say in academia, well, let's ask a committee to do something, to write a white paper about what they think we should do. But the better way to do it is say, hey, here's committee, whatever you come out with, here's $10,000 that you can spend to implement those changes, right? And then those changes become a lot more real. Those changes become a lot more timely and able to be implemented. So I really encourage institutions to not just wait until we can raise money for an anti-racism set of initiatives, right? We have money in our budget now. How can we reapportion that money to actually get done the things that we prioritize? And then going back to what I realized I just skipped over, how many of you have ever had a job or have a job where you got a paycheck? Yeah. Okay. How many of you know what April 15th is? Okay. Tax day, right? Nobody misses it. Nobody misses it because you don't want to miss paying your taxes, and the government doesn't trust you to miss it, so that's why they take your taxes out ahead of time, all right? Because when they decide that they want to do something, they not only set a date on their calendar for it, but they also set up incentives and other accountability structures to make sure that you do it, right? And that's the kind of attitude that we need when we're doing this work. We can't just decide that we're going to go out and do this without there being any consequence if we fail, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, there's not enough people in the pipeline. That doesn't mean that we can't try to do other things, right? And so this idea of accountability comes in two forms, one at the institutional level and also at the personal level. So promises and commitments for action need to be commensurate with incentives for success and consequences for failure, okay? There's a lot of white papers that have been written out there, and there's a lot of work that hasn't been done, lots of great ideas, okay? And these measurable goals for change need to be incorporated into action plans, but also implications for leaders, right? How much more are you willing to do something if you know that your job's on the line, right? It makes a difference if you know that you're going to be held responsible for actually doing things that are on the action plan. And then, of course, as an institution, you need to commit to not stopping until success is actually achieved. Now, I just talked about accountability at the institutional level, but also at the personal level, it's important, okay? As leaders, we can't just charge a committee to come up with recommendations and then the problem is solved. There's a lot that's associated with this anti-racism that has to do with me, that has to do with you, and our individual and personal attitudes. And so there's work that needs to be done by the individual as well. And so there needs to also be some personal accountability that can't be outsourced to a committee. And so I guess with that in conclusion, sorry, skipping ahead. As I mentioned, I helped co-author a work that has a list of recommendations, and there are many out there. They span lots of different constituencies, they span lots of different topics, but really, before you read that, before you read anything, I really encourage you to think through these ideas of having the right attitude, being clear about what you're doing, setting up structures for accountability, and being willing to commit the resources necessary to make sure that the work gets done. So your immediate next steps from this: first, check your boarding pass, update your name tag, acknowledge that you're a racist, take out your glasses so that you can see and be focused and make sure that you can actually take action. Set up your calendar and your accountability structures so that you make sure that you don't miss tax day and then things just don't happen. And then finally, take out your wallet and actually give people the money that they need to do work before you start telling them what to do. Thank you.